was not told that, but that's great. So Gideon, great to see you. Thank you for coming. And we've been working together with Gideon and my college friend, Alan Grossman, who's also with Masorti, to do our Masorti bond drive and Masorti fundraising every year. But Gideon is the executive director of the Masorti Foundation. Masorti means tradition. It is our movement worldwide, and particularly in Israel. And he's specifically the executive director of Masorti in Israel, Foundation for Israel. And he's been at since 2018. He oversees all development, communication, advocacy, and activities. He has over 30 years of Jewish communal experience focused on Israel, and was the CEO of Amenu, which was is the largest progressive Zionist movement in North America. He was formerly president and CEO of Hayas, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and has been a member of the community relations committees of the Jewish Federation in the New York area, particularly in Jersey. You're active at Bethel Synagogue in South Orange, so give my regards over there. And without any further ado, please take it away, Gideon Aranoff. And those of you, we're going to pin it here so that those who are in the sanctuary can see. If you need to kind of move up a little to be able to see better, you're welcome to do that. They'll get pinned.
So thank you, Shabbat Shalom to everyone. And thank you, Rabbi Grossman. It is an amazing pleasure for me to be with this congregation. Your leadership, the leadership of our friends and supporters, Cheryl and Herb Gillette, and so many others, are a powerful example of the kind of partnership that Masorti Foundation seeks to create across the United States. Thank you for inviting me this Shabbat to come and speak about the multiple crises facing Israel today, and what I believe is a very positive and key role that Masorti Israel can play in addressing these underlying challenges. I'm pleased to be with you virtually today from New Jersey, and as we move out of our unique COVID year, I look forward to having a time when I can be with the community in person very, very soon. I feel very close to this community. So, multiple crises facing Israel now. Right out of the headlines, out of the breaking news bulletins on television, we see a series of interwoven crises that Israel is facing. Some of them are of recent origin, and some of them are historic, that go back to the founding of the Jewish state. To start with, we have the religion and state, Judaism and democracy status quo in Israel, where the first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, essentially has outsourced Jewish practice and Jewish life to ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Israelis and institutions. What this has created is a systematic discriminatory system where Orthodox institutions and ultra-Orthodox institutions are under the leadership of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbinate, cause great harm to the Jewish life of your average Israelis, particularly in the area of life cycle events, of marriage, conversion, burial, kashrut, kotel, etc. We also see very challenging soul searching on the part of Israel about whether or not Israel is in fact a Jewish state or a democratic state or a democratic and Jewish state. Are these values in conflict? Do so-called liberal Jews in Israel and in the diaspora care more about Israel's democracy than as a Jewish state? What is our stake here in the future of Israel on this particular question? So I would note that the religious makeup of Jewish Israelis are under 10% identifying as ultra-Orthodox or Haredi. We have another 10% plus identifying as Dati, Orthodox in an Israeli context. And the rest, which is another 40 40%, as I mentioned, being secular, and an additional 40% being part of a traditional or other religious identifying population of Israeli Jews. What we see in this is that a system of ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox domination leaves the vast majority of Israeli Jews unserved or even undermined in their Jewish life by this system that focuses on the needs and the power of Haredi and Dati Israelis. Just 3 examples on budgets. Israel functions essentially as a state funder of religious services. And this in principle could work. However, we have a combination of state funding and we have a near monopoly for Orthodox and Haredi Jewish life in Israel. And what we see is upwards of $1 billion a year being devoted from state coffers for religious life, religious institutions, rabbis, schools, synagogues of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Israeli sectors. And we find Masorti, conservative Judaism, and Reform, progressive Judaism in Israel, struggling to receive just a couple of $100,000, all for very targeted programs for youth or diaspora engagement, those type of activities. One of the fundamental areas where we see this discrimination coming out is in the area of marriage. It's painful for me to report that in the Jewish state, freely chosen Jewish weddings officiated by our Masorti conservative rabbis are not recognized by the state, and that our rabbis and our couples are in fact at risk of 2 years in prison for these illegal weddings. This is a reality that is an enduring call to action for conservative Jews here in the United States. Next, the Kotel. The Kotel is an area that essentially under the status quo functions as an ultra-Orthodox synagogue with separation of men and women and control by the chief rabbinate and the chief rabbinate's representatives at the Kotel. What we saw as a hopeful sign in 2016 was an agreement that was developed to provide an egalitarian prayer space at the Kotel and more equality for Reform, for Masorti conservative, and for the Women of the Wall organization in the excuse me, oversight and management of life at the Kotel. In 2017, under great pressure from Haredi parties, we saw the freezing of the Kotel agreement. And this is really a terrible, terrible backtracking on a piece of the best piece of progress we've seen in the area of Jewish pluralism and Jewish pluralistic life in Israel. But it's not only that, and this is really tragic, and we saw this as recently as yesterday, where ultra-Orthodox Jews take this policy as a permission slip to harass and to disrupt Women of the Wall, Masorti, Reform, and other Jewish practice at the Kotel. And I want to give a from the ground report that Rakefet Ginsburg, who is the new CEO of the Masorti Movement of Israel, reported to us just yesterday. And again, she's reporting from the ground, so it is, I think, very powerful. She writes, "Terrible blasphemy. That's all I have to say. Dozens of ultra-Orthodox youth and adults at the Kotel tearing up the prayer text we prepared and prepared by the Women of the Wall, stepping on them, a desecration of God's name. These primitive outlaws kick, step, corrupt, and curse. And zero condemnations by the Orthodox rabbis, zero condemnation by the national Orthodox media." Right from the ground, and just yesterday. And again, I would encourage people to check out some really very disturbing video that we posted yesterday, and after Shabbat to take a look at that on our website. A second crisis is this growing rift between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. According to the latest Pew study, 41% of Jews say they are not very or at all emotionally attached to Israel. And 42% say they don't closely follow news about the Jewish state. These numbers from Pew are even more dramatic when one looks at younger Jews and more liberal Jews. And so what we see from this is a growing apart within the Jewish family, and that is of great concern. We also saw a very disturbing comment from former Israeli ambassador to the US, Ron Dermer, who very recently was quoted as saying that Israel should prioritize the passionate and unequivocal support of Israel of evangelical Christians over American Jews, who he said are, quote, disproportionately among our critics. And so we see two crises that are deeply connected. Does the form of delegitimization of Judaism that the overwhelming majority of American Jews practice impact how American Jews relate to the state of Israel? While the status quo agreement may make sense historically, this dramatic favoritism against our Jewish practice and the failure of the government to support Jewish pluralism makes it harder to see ourselves as part of one whole Jewish people. A third crisis Israel faces, and this was particularly brought out during the latest fighting between Israel and Hamas, is the intercommunal, the conflict between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs across the country, with a particular prevalence in mixed cities like the city of Lod or mixed regions like the Galilee. In these areas, we saw rioting, violence, lynchings, desecration of religious sites and cemeteries. We saw a massive breakdown of the fundamental trust and social solidarity amongst Israelis and amongst communities. A fourth area of crisis, the political instability and gridlock. And again, if there's a single story we've seen about Israel in the last 2 years, it is the never-ending election cycle in Israeli politics. There have been 4 elections. No party has been able to establish a stable government during this time. There has not been a budget, a state budget for Israel for at least a couple of years. Is this poised to change? It might be. Stay tuned. Tomorrow is a key vote where the Knesset, the parliament, will have an opportunity to approve a very broad-based power-sharing government of 8 parties who will need 61 votes in the Knesset to be approved and sworn in. So again, stay tuned. In sum, it's a perilous time for Israel on so many fronts. Those of us who love Israel, who long for a common future, see this as a call to action. And before turning to how I see the Masorti movement of Israel as being at the heart of trying to find solutions to these crises, I want to quickly outline what the Masorti movement is for people who have not interacted much with Israeli Masorti Jews. What does Masorti Israel believe? Masorti Israel strives for a Jewish state that is the home for all Jews, not just for a small faction. A Jewish state that cares about equal religious rights for all. A Jewish state where all Jews can access the Jewish tradition, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, ethnic background, Jewish learning, or physical or mental challenges. A Jewish state that understands that it is its Jewish and democratic identity, its character, as something that is intertwined, not in conflict. That the prophetic vision of Tikkun Olam and the commitment to justice, compassion, and inclusion is a Jewish calling, and that the unity of the Jewish tradition and modern life is a blessing for all of Israel. And finally, that Klal Yisrael, Jewish peoplehood, and its vision that Israeli and diaspora Jews have a united Jewish future, that truly Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh, all Jews are responsible one for another. So that's what Masorti Israel believes. But what does Masorti Israel do? I'm pleased to share briefly the story of the fantastic growth we've seen over the last several years in the Masorti movement of Israel, of the increasing numbers of Masorti communities, currently over 87, from the Negev to the Galilee, of over 1,600 kids who are guided through Jewish and Zionist values through Masorti's Noam youth movement and the Ramah Noam summer camp, of the Masorti coordinated prayer space at the Kotel that continues to thrive notwithstanding the pressures of the abrogated Kotel deal, where over 100,000 Israelis have participated in religious services where they can pray together as their own form of Judaism, together, men and women, adults and children, praying with full equality. Of the over 360 special needs kids who are brought to be able to fully participate in Jewish life through the Special Needs Bar and Bat Mitzvah program. And just one tidbit here. One mother told us that through the Special Needs Bar and Bat Mitzvah program of the Adraba Center of Masorti, she, for the first time in her life, heard someone say Mazal Tov about her beloved child for something that they had done in their Jewish life. And that is the work of Masorti with the special needs kids. Of the thousands of Israelis each year who are trained through the Masorti Jewish Pluralism Watch program to be civically engaged with the Knesset, with the government, to promote religious pluralism and to learn the skills that they need to hold the political feet to the fire of the government on issues of religious freedom for Israelis. Of the many thousands of Israelis, and growing each year, who are turning to Masorti for their most personal of life cycle events, b'nai mitzvah, weddings, conversions, burials, who are seeking to fulfill their truest sense, their authentic sense as Jews without the coercion of the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbinate. So that's what Masorti is in a nutshell. So how does Masorti Israel stand as a key part of the solution to the multiple crises I outlined at the beginning? I would suggest that Masorti Israel is well placed to be a key player in finding these solutions. First, Masorti Israel, in its essence, is an example of pluralism in action. Masorti Jews identify across the political spectrum. Unlike many sectors of Israeli society, Masorti's vision of pluralism and multiplicity of identities and ideologies lead Masorti Jews to vote for a wide variety of political parties, from the left, right, center. And in many respects, Masorti Israel stands as an embodiment of a set of values that the, I would say, likely, probable, possible new government that will be possibly approved tomorrow stands for. This is a government that includes, again, 8 parties, including, for the first time, an Arab Islamist party as part of the government. And we see this as a reflection of the big tent vision of life in Israel that Masorti represents. If this comes to pass, we have some cautiously optimistic reasons to be hopeful based on this new government. We see the ultra-Orthodox parties not being part of this coalition, which is a very unusual occurrence for many decades in Israeli political life. We see a commitment to return to the Kotel agreement, and I would hope have the authorities stand with our people and with women of the wall and with our Reform colleagues in their rights to practice Judaism at the Kotel in free from discrimination and free from harassment. Second area that I think is very important is that Masorti Israel is an indigenous movement. And I would note that over 50% of the activists of Masorti Israel are native-born Israelis, and the rest come from a very wide array of immigrant backgrounds from Latin America, from the former Soviet Union, where they are building a domestic constituency for a set of values that we share here in the American conservative movement. When we think about the really scary pictures we saw of the conflict between Jews and Arabs during the fighting with Hamas, we see a situation where Masorti can actually be part of the answer. And I wanted to read a quote to you from one of our rabbis, Rabbi Yoav Endi, who is the head of the Hanaton Educational Center in the Galilee, who wrote, I think very movingly, he wrote, "I'll tell you what we've been doing day in and day out here in Hanaton, because we've been working for the last 10 years with courageous partners in the villages." And when he says villages, he means the Arab villages around Hanaton. We're meeting people these days, day in, day out. We're in the villages, we're talking, we're creating circles of trust in conversations. We're standing together, we're holding up signs that say, quote, we still believe in a shared future. We know there's no other alternative than to build one society with a shared future vision for our children. And so here's a case where Masorti, not despite being focused on Jewish traditional values, but because of being focused on Jewish traditional values, are playing a powerful role of unity and coexistence with all Israelis. A third area that I would note is that Masorti Israel is dedicated to helping all Israeli Jews find their authentic paths to Jewish life in the Jewish state. Truly, how can a state be the Jewish state if it ignores the Jewish religious life of the vast majority of Israeli Jews? And in fact, the Jewish People Policy Institute recently reported that 800,000 Israelis, 13% and growing, identify with Masorti or with Reform Judaism in Israel. This shows a massive market for the kind of Jewish services, education, activism, and life that Masorti Israel is putting forth. With sufficient resources, our partners in Israel are poised to expand and serve this growing segment of Israeli Jewish population. And finally, for those of us who care deeply about Jewish unity and Jewish peoplehood, Masorti is a key part of the answer. Masorti's domestic Israeli agenda, which again they are doing for themselves, for Israeli Jews, has an added powerful benefit to a global Jewish sense of connectedness and pluralism between diaspora and Israeli Jews. They are working tirelessly for an Israeli future that is pluralistic, inclusive, egalitarian, compassionate, and just. This is the kind of Israel that I believe diaspora Jews, particularly the overwhelming majority of diaspora Jews who identify with conservative or reform or other liberal streams of Judaism, can identify with, where our Judaism will be treated equally in the state of Israel, in the Jewish state, where we will not be second-class Jews in this homeland for all Jews. And as such, this is a very promising future for the essential Jewish value of Klal Yisrael. So to conclude, I think this is where US Jews come in. We are seeing amazing opportunities for Masorti in Israel to educate, to engage, to provide meaningful Jewish life cycle services, to advocate. But in the face of an unequal playing field, it is support from diaspora Jews that will allow Masorti Israel to fulfill its promise. That is where we in the Masorti Foundation come in. We are working to build a network of supporters across the US, donors at all levels, and storytellers who can tell the story of Masorti Israel to the American Jewish public, to tell about the programs, about the advocacy, to be true partners with Masorti Israel. I believe this partnership is exemplified by Beth Shalom Congregation and by Rabbi Grossman's leadership of the community. By your standing together with the Masorti movement of Israel, year in and year out, you are a key part of the solution to these crises. And we in the Masorti Foundation applaud your community for this amazing work. I encourage all the members of the community to learn more about Masorti Israel, to sign up for news releases, and to support Masorti in every way you possibly can. After Shabbat, I hope people will check out all that is available on the Masorti website, www.masorti.org. We really encourage you to be part of this partnership with us here and with our partners in Israel. So to close, I wish everyone in the community a restful and peaceful Shabbat, one that can energize us all to continue the struggle for equality, justice, inclusion, and pluralism in Israel. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom and Toda Rabban. Thank you, Gideon, for your leadership, and to the entire staff. And we'll continue to try to do our part here in Columbia, Maryland, and in the United States to support you. I do want to kind of raise up the fact that a number of rabbis in the conservative and reform movement, and even a couple of Orthodox rabbis, had made a commitment in at our last in-person rabbinic meeting for AIPAC, or it was a special meeting for just rabbis. We committed to not supporting any organization that did not recognize us and our members as Jews or as rabbis. And so when, as you get those envelopes in the mail, before I know automatically we always grew up, you send at least something to everybody who sends you, but think first, is this an organization that undermines the democracy of the state of Israel? And does it undermine the legitimacy of ourselves and our ways of doing Judaism? And then take that same money and send it to Masorti.